Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the CFPR seminar. And so today we are very happy to have Dr. Cheng to share with us her research project on wealth accumulation by hypogamy in own and parental education in China. And so Dr. Cheng is an assistant professor of sociology at Singapore Management University. She received her PhD from Princeton University in sociology and with academic focus on demography. And so in general that her research includes family demography, gender inequality, and social epidemiology. And specifically, her previous and recent works have been examining the dynamics of extended family relationships and how those extended relationships reflect gender inequality and health disparities. And her work has appeared in very prestigious journals such as Journal of Marriage and Family and Social Science and Medicine. And so later on, we'll still follow the convention that we will let Dr. Cheng to finish her presentation first for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then followed by a Q&A session. And so if during the process you have any questions, just please hold them a little bit and just type in the chat box and saying that I have a question. And then later on, after the presentation is finished, we can have Dr. Cheng to address your questions and comments in order. All right. And so without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Cheng.
Is my volume on? Is the volume okay for everybody? Okay. Thank you very much, Fujin, for the generous introduction, and thank you, Poke, for inviting me to this amazing opportunity. I'm very happy today to share with you guys a working project in collaboration with my colleague Yang Zhou from Central University of Finance and Economics. So this paper, we're trying to look at how household wealth accumulation's trajectories vary by marital sorting, by own education and parental education in the context of contemporary China. So in many societies in the past few decades, there has been this trend of the decline and even reversal of the gender gap in education, meaning that women on average are now having higher levels of education than men. And the reversal of the gender gap in education in the population reshapes the educational difference within the family between the husband and wife. And that leads to an increasing relevance or prevalence of educational hypogamy, which is those marriages where the wife is more educated than the husband. So there's this emerging literature trying to understand the implications of rising educational hypogamy or female status dominant marriages for the economic well-being of the couples. One of the findings is that although men's economic well-being or men's income trajectories do not vary much by educational assorted mating, women in hypogamous marriages tend to achieve larger increases in personal income over time. And this is the literature we are trying to address in our entry point to the literature for this project. There are two limitations in existing literature on educational hypogamy and couples' economic well-being we are trying to address in this paper. First is, while prior research has focused primarily on how educational hypogamy shapes couples' individual earning trajectories, we are much more interested in what the implications of female status dominant marriages for family level economic well-being. So what does it mean for a wife to be more educated than her husband for the household level financial well-being? The other limitation we try to address in this project is to think about how spouses are sorted into marriages, not only based on their own education, meaning that when you try to find a spouse, you're not only looking into your partner's educational attainment, but also looking at your partner's family background, your partner's parental education. And this comes from this emerging literature on how spouses sort into marriages based on their parental education over and above their own education. And by looking into how marital sorting by parental education influences household wealth outcomes, we are interested in this alternative form of female status dominant marriage, where the wife is of higher status, not because she has higher education than her husband, but because she comes from a higher status family, and how her coming from a higher status family may influence the household wealth accumulation trajectories of the household as a unit. So in a nutshell, in this project, we want to examine how marital sorting on the education of two generations, couples' own education and couples' parental education, shapes their accumulation of household wealth, which is an indicator of both short-term and long-term financial well-being at the household level. And by addressing this question, we hope to make three contributions to the literature. First is we think about educational hypogamy and wealth outcomes as an important extension of the existing literature on education hypogamy and individual earning outcomes, because individual income and wealth are conceptually distinct. When we think about income, this is something that's a one-time measure, but wealth is a cumulative stock that's accumulated over time. It signals the long-term economic advancement of the household as a unit, as opposed to an individual. And wealth entails cumulative advantages in not only financial capital, but also in human capital and social capital across generations. So by looking into how educational hypogamy shapes wealth accumulation outcomes, we're trying to look at how the role of marital sorting in wealth stratification in a rising global wealth inequality, in an era of rising global wealth inequality. The second contribution we try to make to this literature is, as I mentioned earlier, couples sort on not only their own education, but also their parental education. In stratification literature, we usually think about parental education as something that's an ascribed trait, whereas own education is an achieved trait. So in the case of marital sorting or mate selection, couples sort on both ascribed traits and achieved traits. From my own dissertation, although sometimes the wife may not be more educated than her husband, meaning that the wife may not have higher achieved traits than her husband, her higher parental education or higher ascribed traits may empower her in marriages and allow her to have more decision-making power in household decisions. So if you think about having decision-making power as something, as an indication of women having higher status in the family, then female status dominant marriages can essentially take more than just one form. So it can take the form of hypogamy based on achieved traits, meaning when the wife is more educated than the husband, but female status dominant marriages can also be hypogamy based on ascribed traits. So that's when the wife comes from a higher status family. Her parents are more educated than her husband's parents. So it's really, we're trying to understand how female status dominant marriages in both of these forms, achieved traits and ascribed traits, may shape different wealth accumulation trajectories for the household. And the final contribution we intend to make to the literature has to do with extending the perspective from individual economic well-being to extended family well-being, from individual trajectories to how extended families may have an influence on the household. So this is in the wealth literature, household wealth accumulation involves not only just a couple, but also the extended family. So an example would be in today's rising housing market across the globe, it's much harder for the young couple to afford a marital home based on their own income at the beginning of the marriage. So there's a lot of intergenerational wealth transfers going on at the time of marriage when the extended family, both the husband's parents and the wife's parents, support the young couple to establish their new marriage, establish their new marital home. Parental resources in that way are often integral to the financial foundation of children's marriage. And intergenerational transfers are particularly crucial for young couples' accumulation of housing wealth, which is the largest component of household wealth. So by looking into how hypogamy based on ascribed traits, or having a wife's parents more educated than husband's parents, or marital sorting based on not only own education, but also parental education, and how marital sorting based on parental education may influence wealth accumulation outcomes, we're hoping to provide some insights into the influence of the extended family in this wealth accumulation process through marital sorting. So in a nutshell, the question we are trying to address is this: how do couples' wealth trajectories vary by different types of hypogamy? So we're interested in essentially 4 categories of hypogamy. First is hypogamy in neither generation, meaning that the wife has neither higher education, own education, nor higher parental education than the husband. So basically non-hypogamy. This is our reference point. And then we distinguish hypogamy based on ascribed traits and achieved traits. So hypogamy in child generation only, meaning that the wife has higher education than her husband, but her parents' education may not be higher than the husband's parents' education. Hypogamy in parent generation only means that the wife's parents have higher education than the husband's parents, although the wife's education may not be higher than the husband's. And finally, hypogamy in both generations, meaning that not only the wife has higher education than her husband, but also her parents have higher education than her husband's parents. So we are trying to look at how household wealth trajectories may differ depending on whether we look into hypogamy in child generation, in parent generation, or in both generations. And to make sure each of these types of hypogamy are comparable to each other, we hold the average education in each generation constant, meaning that we control for the average education of the husband and the wife, and the average education of the husband's parents and the wife's parents. And by doing so, essentially we're thinking, given the same total education of the couple and the same total education of the couple's respective parents, how would the educational pairings between the husband and wife, educational pairings between the husband's parents and the wife's parents shape different wealth trajectories for the household? So that's essentially a nutshell of the research question we're interested in. And we examine that question in the context of contemporary China. And the reason why I focus on China has to do with the social and demographic trends going on at the moment. First is the closing gender gap in education we observe in China in the past few decades. In urban China, in more recent cohorts, the women have, on average, have higher levels of education than men. In rural China, the gap in education between men and women has also been closing in the recent decades, which makes the topic of hypogamy, where the wife is more educated than the husband, increasingly relevant. The second reason we're interested in the case of China has to do with the indispensable role of family backgrounds in marriage formation. China has the tradition of marriage of matching doors, so parental backgrounds, family backgrounds have always been a very important criteria when people think about who to marry, and parents' approvals are still quite important in the marriage formation process. Not only are parents playing a very important role in marital selection and marriage formation, parents continue to be heavily involved in the lives of their children after they get married. This can be reflected in providing financial support at the beginning of the marriage by helping couples purchase a marital home, as well as continuous financial support throughout the marriage to sustain a certain level of standards of living for the young couple, and also providing some instrumental support such as grandparental care, such as grandchild care, etc. And traditionally, intergenerational ties have been primarily patrilineal, meaning that there's closer connections between the couple and the husband's parents. But increasingly, intergenerational ties have become more bilateral in contemporary China, meaning that not only the couple has close connections with the husband's parents, but also with the wife's parents. And the wife's parents are increasingly involved in the lives of the young couple by providing not only financial assistance, but also instrumental support, such as taking care of the grandchildren. And all that is happening in this context of rising wealth inequalities. And the extent of wealth inequality in China exceeds the extent of income inequality even. So it makes it particularly important to think about the implications of marital sorting on wealth stratification in this context of rising wealth inequalities in China. So how does hypogamy shape wealth accumulation trajectories? So we hypothesize that hypogamy, based on whether be it own education or parental education, is positively associated with wealth accumulation over time. In child generation, meaning that the wife is more educated than the husband, child generation hypogamy may experience more wealth accumulation for mainly two reasons. First has to do with the higher combined financial capabilities of the couple, which I will elaborate in a second. And the other has to do with the wife's elevated influence over family decision-making. So the couple's combined financial capabilities to acquire assets may be higher in hypogamous marriages, which enable them to accumulate wealth at the household level. And this is mainly because of the more egalitarian division of labor in hypogamous marriages. The division of labor tends to be more egalitarian in hypogamous marriages, which allows women to experience less motherhood penalty and enjoy faster increases in earnings over time. In contrast, the husband's earnings trajectories really do not vary much by educational pairings. So if you think about, given the same total education of the husband and wife, given the same total human capital or earnings potential of the couple, if women can experience less motherhood penalty and enjoy larger increases in earnings over time, whereas husband's earnings do not vary much by educational pairings, then the combined financial capabilities of the wife and the husband is going to be higher for hypogamous marriages compared to non-hypogamous marriages. And if the couple's combined financial capabilities are higher in hypogamous marriages, it allows couples to acquire more assets and hence accumulate more wealth over time. So in a nutshell, given the more egalitarian division of labor in the household, given the more promising income trajectories of the wife in hypogamous marriages, we hypothesize that hypogamy based on own education is positively associated with wealth accumulation at household level. The other reason why we think child generation hypogamy may experience more wealth accumulation has to do with the wife's elevated influence over family decision-making. So again, this is something based on my own previous work, is that women in hypogamous marriages tend to have more bargaining power and influence over family decisions. When the wife has more education than her husband, she tends to be the final decision maker in the household. In prior research in financial decision-making has shown that women tend to make decisions that prioritize family well-being, whereas men tend to prioritize own preferences in decision-making. So again, given the same total education of the husband and wife, given the same financial decision-making capabilities, if you will, of the husband and the wife, then the more involved the wife is in the decision-making process, the more likely the financial decision-making of the household will prioritize family well-being over individual preferences. So taking that together, we hypothesize that child generation hypogamy may experience more wealth accumulation given the wife's increased decision-making power over household decisions. Now, how would parent generation hypogamy relate to wealth accumulation? meaning that when the wife's parents are more educated than the husband's parents, how would that change the wealth accumulation process? Given patriarchal traditions, and this is something that's true in China, in South Korea, in other societies with patriarchal traditions, husbands' parents are obligated to support young couples' new marital home, regardless of wife's parental status. However, in the case of parent-generation hypogamy, couples may receive this additional support from wife's parents who wouldn't otherwise provide support if given patriarchal traditions. Wife's parents may provide support to the young couple in parent-generation hypogamy because now they have the stronger incentives to maintain the dominant role in the extended family, to provide various forms of financial assistance to improve their daughter's economic well-being, to sustain their daughter's status in the family, and furthermore, to secure their own age support. So in a way, think about it as an exchange relationship when the wife's parents providing support to the young couple in the hopes that in return, they will also provide support to them. The young couple would also provide support to the wife, to the wife's parents in the future. So there is incentives on the part of the wife's parents to support a young couple in the case of parent-generation hypogamy. And additional support from the wife's parents provides something that's very uniquely advantageous for the young couple in the process of wealth accumulation. First of all, it enlarges couples' accumulated wealth through direct asset transfers. Now the young couple not only has transfers from the husband's parents, but also from the wife's parents. So they have higher quantity of intergenerational support. But also the wife's parents contribute something that's more diversified resources that husband's parents would not otherwise possess. So intergenerational transfers not only exceed in quantity, but also exceed in quality and diversity for the young couple when they receive this additional support from wife's parents. Another advantage of having support from the wife's parents is that it enables young couples to acquire more assets through improved career trajectories. Husband's parents primarily support the husband's career to maintain the patriarch, but both the wife and the husband may benefit from the support from the wife's parents. So an example would be, in a lot of scenarios, the wife's parents may help the husband introduce the husband to job opportunities, to providing advice on financial decisions, in the hopes of by improving the husband's career trajectories, it will also improve the economic well-being of their daughter. So it's also from the perspective of the wife's parents, they also have this incentive to support the husband's career trajectories in addition to support the wife's career trajectories, whereas the husband's parents really focus on supporting the husband's career trajectories. So taking that together with the additional support from the wife's parents, both the husband and the wife may benefit from this additional support from the wife's parents. And in a nutshell, that's why we hypothesize that parent-generation hypogamy, where the wife's parents are more educated than the husband's parents, may improve wealth accumulation of the household as a whole. So in a nutshell, we hypothesize that couples in hypogamous marriages, whether in child generation or parent generation, may accumulate more wealth over time. We tried to examine these hypotheses using the data from the China Family Panel studies, and we used the waves from 2010 to 2018. We restricted our sample to couples who were married after the economic reform between 1978 and 2009. And we ended up with about 25,000 couple-year observations from about 6,000 couples. The outcomes we're interested in are household wealth, and because parents play a very strong role in attainment of housing at the beginning of the marriage, we also looked into the accumulation of housing assets over time in addition to just total wealth of the household. We looked, as mentioned earlier, we looked into 4 types of hypogamy. The first type is basically non-hypogamy, which is the largest group of our sample, given the tradition of marriage of matching doors and hypogamy in the Chinese society. And we distinguish hypogamy in child generation versus parent generation. And you see that is not so often for the wife to have both higher education and higher parental education than the husband. So hypogamy in both generations consists of about 7% of our sample. We control for several variable attributes that may influence couples' marital sorting and wealth outcomes. So as mentioned earlier, to make types of hypogamy comparable to each other, we hold average education of the couple and average education of the couple's parents constant. In addition, we adjusted for several attributes that influence household wealth. That includes household size, living arrangements, couple's age, ethnicity, hukou, and sibling status, as well as urban rural residence and region of the household. We utilized multi-level growth curve modeling to examine how wealth trajectories over years of marriage progress over time. The major advantage of multi-growth curve model is that it estimates between couple differences in within couple changes. In human language, that means we are able to understand how couples vary in their wealth trajectories. And we're also able to compare how couples in different types of hypogamy vary in their wealth trajectories. It's also very flexible with unbalanced data, especially with unequally spaced time points. Suppose a couple is only interviewed in 2010 and 2014, but not in 2012 or 16 or 18, we'd still be able to use their data because as long as we have 2 time points, they would be able to contribute to the wealth trajectory, the estimation of wealth trajectories. So unbalanced data is not an issue in the case of multi-level growth curve models. And we estimate 2 sets of models. In the first set model, we're really interested in just the mean difference, how wealth levels differ by different types of marriage. In the second set of model, we're interested in growth rate difference, meaning that do couples in certain types of marriages accumulate wealth faster than couples in other types of marriages? So by distinguishing model 1 and model 2, we're able to tell whether couples differ in the level of wealth they accumulated over time and also the rate of accumulating wealth over time. And this is showing you the results for total wealth. So first of all, if you look at the coefficient for years of marriage, what that means is that as time progresses, couples accumulate more wealth over time. But our main interest lies in the coefficients for hypogamy types. And you see that any type of hypogamy in child generation, in parent generation, or in both generations are associated with higher accumulation of total wealth. And hypogamy in both generations, where the wife has both higher own education and higher parental education, is associated with higher total wealth. So this is under model 1. In model 2, we further looked at the interaction between hypogamy types and years of marriage. So this is helping us to understand whether the rate of wealth accumulation varies depending on the type of hypogamy. And what we see here is that in the case of hypogamy in both generations, where again, the wife having both higher education and higher parental education, they accumulate total wealth much faster than the other types, than non-hypogamy. Several other results that's useful to look at, useful to think about, is that we controlled for mean education of the couple and mean education of the couple's parents. So again, having higher levels of education of the couple and having higher levels of education of parental education are associated with higher levels of wealth accumulation over time. We find similar results for housing assets. So again, any type of hypogamy, whether the wife has higher education than the husband, or wife having higher education than the wife's parents having higher education than the husband's parents, are associated with higher levels of housing assets. And in particular, if you will notice that the coefficients in this model are higher than the previous model, meaning that there's some indication of hypogamy playing an even stronger role in accumulation for housing assets compared to the accumulation of just total assets, which makes sense, again, if you think about how parents play a very strong role in the beginning of the stage of marriage, helping couples acquire housing assets. And because of a lot of this intergenerational transfer for housing happens at the beginning of the stage of marriage, we don't see as much of a difference in terms of the rate of housing assets accumulation over time, differ by types of hypogamy. So to visually summarize our results, this is plotting total wealth in absolute yuan, or RMB, over years of marriage. And again, you see wealth accumulation increases over years of marriage, but it differs depending on the types of marriage. The solid line is showing you hypogamy in both generations, meaning that the wife has higher education than the husband. The wife's parents have higher education than the husband's parents. They show not only the highest level of total wealth, but also faster increases in total wealth over time compared to the other types of marriage. Hypogamy in child generation or parent generation are associated with higher levels of total wealth compared to hypogamy in either generations or non-hypogamy. So in a nutshell, what we find is that couples in hypogamous marriages, either in the wife's own education or parental education was higher, these couples tend to experience larger gains in total wealth over time. Couples where the wife had both higher own and parental education experienced the largest gains in total wealth. And we also see that hypogamous marriages were especially advantageous with respect to housing assets. Although such advantages were reflected more in mean difference than in rates of increase of housing wealth. The major limitation of this our project has to do with the issue of selection. So there are two directions of selection that we can think about in terms of selection to hypogamy. First is, suppose women who tend to have higher premarital wealth want to have higher decision-making power in the home, want to have higher control over their own wealth in the home. They would hypothetically purposefully choose hypogamy because they can maintain their higher status in the household and maintain higher decision-making power in the household. And hence, these couples may also have higher post-marital wealth because of the premarital wealth advantages of these women who choose to live in hypogamy. This means that hypogamous marriages, where women tend to have higher decision-making power, having more egalitarian division of labor, husbands, wives, parents having more influence over a young couple, allows these young couples to maintain their advantages in premarital wealth and accumulate more wealth over time. That makes it harder to distinguish for us whether it's because of selection into hypogamy or the causal effect of hypogamy. But it really didn't alter our main arguments, being that female status dominant marriages enable couples to accumulate more wealth over time, because it's really telling the same story, meaning that hypogamy is associated with higher wealth accumulation because of wives' elevated status, because of the more egalitarian division of labor, because of the additional support from the wife's parents. The other direction of selection of hypogamy could be that wives parents who have higher premarital wealth choose to not to enter hypogamy, but instead choose non-hypogamy because they want to have married spouses who have equal or higher premarital wealth, in the hopes that by bringing in the stronger forces of both sides of the family, they would be able to have higher postmarital wealth. So in that sense, the positive association between hypogamy and wealth we observed in this study may be an underestimation of the causal effect of hypogamy. So all in all, taken together, is that if we'd be able to address selection into hypogamy in any way, the current estimates will not be altered, but instead it might be an underestimate of the positive association between hypogamy and wealth accumulation. So the take-home message based on our findings is that, first of all, it underscores the crucial role of the wife in household wealth accumulation. Female status dominant marriages tend to have higher wealth accumulation over time. The other important message is that it has to do with the influence of the extended family on household wealth accumulation, especially the wife's natal family. When the wife's parents are more educated than the husband's parents, the young couple is likely to accumulate more housing and total wealth over time. And finally, taking all that together, our study sheds light on the long-term impact of marital sorting, not only within generations, but also across generations on wealth stratification. So that is all for our project, and we look forward to your feedback and suggestions. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheng. And I think we already have a question in the chat box. Vincent, would you like to ask the question in person?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Dr. Cheng. My question is, if you were to do this study looking from the viewpoint of hypergamy, would in fact the results be the same, in that, class differences between the generations accelerate wealth accumulation? Or whether in fact the effects of hypogamy are greater than hypergamy, right? So put another way, is this a story about gender, the advancement of women, or is this actually a story of class differences?
Thank you. That's an excellent question, which is something we think very hard about at the initial stages of this project. So the story I want to tell is about gender differences, which is why we focus on hypogamy. We try to address whether it's about gender or class by controlling for the total education of the couple and the total education of the couple's parents. So as you see, even though the main story is about gender, but we also see class differences. Again, when you look at the coefficients for mean education of the couple and mean education of the couple's parents, having higher total education, of course, is going to accelerate, it improves wealth accumulation over time. The main reason we ended up focusing on hypogamy versus non-hypogamy has to do with two reasons. One is the main motivation of this research, again, is trying to think about this rising trend of reversal gap in education and what it does mean to have a female status dominant marriage versus non-female status dominant marriage, and just focus on that. The interpretations get quite complicated when you have a 3x3 marital sorting types, because we're interested in not only own education, but also parental education. And it makes it quite complicated to think about when you have hypogamy in one generation, but hypergamy in another, and what does that mean? So, which is why we decided on to just simplify the story and just think about what does it mean to have a female status dominant marriages and address this gender versus class issue by holding total education constant. I should also mention that the other advantage of doing this way is that when we control total education, especially in this categorical form, we don't have the ceiling versus flooring problem, meaning that couples in each of these total education categories it's possible for them to fall in each of these hypogamy types.
Yeah, I think that I imagine that you know, the educational differences in the couple would work the same way if the male had more education than the female in both generations, and would produce the same kinds of wealth accumulation effects as would be if the women had more education than the men. So yeah, that's my question of whether it is really the issue of gender or is it actually class, in that the point is that the wealth or the differentials are repeated across G1 and G2, right? Across the generations, and not really who between the couple has more education. Yeah, maybe Sung Hu can phrase it better than me because he has the same question.
Yeah.
Sung Hu, you want to try? I think you are better than putting it than me.
Yeah. So I'm wondering whether, for example, actually, my question is also about the baseline, about a comparison group. So because this comparison group actually consists of couples have a similar education levels, or couples who where man or husband have a higher education than women. So I'm wondering whether it's able to, for example, exclude the couples who have a similar education levels, or whose parents have a similar education levels in a comparison group. Then basically you can compare the hypogamy with hypergamy. Because I find that in your hypothesis you actually imply that for example, if women's parents have a lot of money, they tend to use the money for the family well-being. But on the other hand, if men's parents have a lot of money, they tend to use for men's own purposes. So
yes, I think yes, that's the point. Yes.
Yeah. So actually, yes. So in your hypothesis, you tend to imply that you want to compare hypogamy and hypergamy, but in the actual analysis,
the intergenerational transmission are different for women than men.
Yeah.
The impact of the intergenerational transmission are different for the way that it is used is different for women than for men. That's what you're saying.
Yes. So I think that might make it easier to think about if we just exclude homogamy in both generations. So the complications that with the 3x3 types of marital sorting is that right now, not only the reference group has a mix of people who have homogamy, hypergamy in parent generation or child generation. When you look at our types of hypogamy, it still combines some possibilities of hypergamy and hypogamy in some way, homogamy. So in the case of, for example, hypogamy in the child generation, this group essentially includes couples where the wife's parents have lower or equal levels of education as husband's parents. So you can think about this as parent generation hypergamy or homogamy. If we want to really differentiate hypergamy versus hypogamy, we would have to not only segregate the reference groups, but also segregate different types of hypogamy intersect with different hypergamy and homogamy. So there, I guess what I'm trying to say is there's no easy solution to this, but we could try to focus just on those extreme cases of hypogamy versus hypergamy by taking out homogamy groups. I don't know if I answered that properly, but I understand where you're going. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah. So I'm wondering whether, for example, you can do two separate models. The first model only focus on their only focus on the child level education. Then you can basically have three groups: hypogamy, hypergamy, or same education level. Then the second model only focus on the parental educations. Then you can also distinguish three groups. And for example, here now you combine child generation and parental generation, and so we basically find the same results. And if people have so if they're both hypogamy in child and parental generation, it's significant, but it seems not significant larger than those only in child or parental education level. Yeah, I think maybe we can consider it. Yeah.
The other issue we didn't do that. We should. We'll so do a two-step process, and then the consensus from the existing literature, which looks just at child level, is that you see more positive effect for hypogamy, but not in this case of hypergamy. And it's very much a gender story when really only the wife benefits from the hypogamy status, and husband status doesn't really change as much by educational pairings. But thank you for the suggestion, and we'll see if that will be able to simplify the story.
And if I may, I just quickly jump in on this. I think I already tapped in the chat box. So I think for Vincent's earlier point on how to distinguish between this pairing versus social class, I would think that the patterns of this wealth accumulation may differ on the interaction between social class and the pairing types, right? And so basically the assumption is based on that women's higher education or their parents' higher education may actually translate into their power inside decision making, right? But that may not necessarily happen, especially in those lower social class families, and in like where basically doing gender or gender display may happen a lot. That the women may actually need to make sacrifices and give in order to compensate for their husband's contaminated masculinity. And so I would think that the patterns may actually differ across gender. And for example, if there's no significant interactions between pairing, sorting, and social class, then actually it could lend like stronger evidence showing that actually this gendered pairing, it is universal rather than classed.
Yeah, so I should say, we did several sensitivity analysis related to the previous questions. So the first thing we did is the 3x3 types of marriage. We did that at the very big initial stages of this project. We did see that any indication of hypogamy, whether it's in combination of hypergamy or in combination with homogamy, hypogamy, where any of these 3x3 types of marriages, hypogamy, tend to see higher coefficients or having higher levels of wealth accumulation compared to just this homogamy in both generations. But the reason why we didn't end up doing so is it's really hard to combine 3x3 9 categories without running into multiple comparison. So, but I think the two-stage suggestion is good. And then the second step we did is so 3 by 3 times two levels of mean education would be even more complicated. So instead of doing direct interactions, we did try to look at subgroups and to segregate the sample, split the sample into higher education versus lower education. In this Chinese case, it would be middle school or higher or high school or higher. We did several iterations of just split up the sample into two halves. The results stand very much the same, although the coefficients are smaller and sometimes significance level can call into question because if the sample size gets smaller. But how do we have larger number of observations? It's likely that we probably won't see as much significant interactions just because of this split sample analysis seem to return similar results. Yeah, I should say the 3 by 3 results earlier in my earlier responses, but I feel like it's, again, the point of simplifying is because we still run in this problem. We are still combining hypogamy in child generation and hypergamy in parent generation, even when we split things down, and the comparisons are not as intuitive when we think about it. But thank you very much for the suggestions.
Okay, I think we still have 3 questions in the chat box by Li Ning, Hu Shu, and Puk. So how about we let the audience ask questions all together, and then Cheng probably can incorporate some questions, and then just, okay. So now let's Li Ning, Hu Shu, and Puk to ask questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Cheng. It's a very interesting research. And my question, I actually had a similar question as the previous 2 audiences. And so my second question is, do you have any data on like subjective well-being, something like happiness in the data set? I'm just curious how these different groups will pan out in terms of their marriage well-being.
Hi, Dr. Cheng. Thank you so much for your very fascinating presentation. My first question is kind of related to the class question already raised. So I'm wondering whether the average effect of hypogamy we are seeing here, I mean, because it's averaged across the population, right? And I'm thinking hypogamy might be more prevalent among the highly educated couples. So in fact, what we are seeing here is driven by this marriage of the power couple and this has been shown by earlier research as the dominant driving force for the rising income inequality and wealth inequality in other countries as well. So that's my first comment, maybe. My second question is more methodological. I'm wondering how so what kind of things are included in the total assets? Because I think the intergenerational living arrangement in Chinese families are quite fluid, and they change over time depending on the life course the family is going through. So whether the total assets only refer to the assets owned by the couple, or does it also include co-residing parents or parents-in-law? So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Should I respond now?
I think Puk, do you still want to ask?
Oh, sure. So thank you so much, Cheng. So I enjoy your presentation. I think I might have missed something, but I would like to clarify if you control for SIP composition. Because I understand that the parental transfer you did. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. So that's all. I guess I have to leave, but sorry. Bye. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Okay, so these are all excellent questions and suggestions. So it's our intention to move the next step and look into how hypogamy will bound to different well-being outcomes. We don't have an answer yet, but I think it's something that will be very fascinating to look at. CIPS does measure some overall dimensions of life satisfaction and marital satisfaction. So it's something that it's well in our agenda to think about moving forward. The other question related to power couples. So again, this is something we're essentially very, at the beginning really worried about, is that it's all couples who are having a higher education fall into this hypogamy category. And again, by the way we structure the data and by controlling for average education in categories, we not all couples, contrary to what we take for granted, is that there are a mix of educational levels within this hypogamy groups. And even when we split up the sample into the higher end of mean education and the lower ends of the mean education, still the results remain very similar. So it's possible. So it's possible the higher couples have higher education because because of this positive coefficients of mean education. But again, the main results on different types of hypogamy still stands, and there are a mix of educational levels even in these different hypogamy groups. Another question has to do with the living arrangements and measuring of total wealth. So total wealth is measured at the household level, which would include people who are members of the household other than the husband and the wife. And to adjust for that issue, because it's a mix of household of multiple people, so we adjust for household size and also adjusted for intergenerational co-residence, so whether the couple is living with the husband's parents or the wife's parents or neither. And at one point, we also try to limit just to people who live alone and just take out those couples who are co-residing. But again, results remain pretty much the same. So by having household size and intergenerational co-residence, we're trying to adjust for this issue of having a mix of household members in the household. But I think just by looking into intergeneration itself could be another very interesting paper. But the focus of this study, of course, is just to look at the marital types. In Pocardi lab, but we did adjust for the number of siblings. And at one point, we also looked into just the number of older brothers, number of younger brothers to think about the age, sex, composition of the siblings. But nothing really changes. So we ended up just looking at number of siblings at the end.
I think we have one last comment from Prof. Yang. Prof. Yang is still here. Do you want to make the comments in person?
No, it's just a comment. I don't need to say anything. Thank you.
Okay. So basically, Cheng, you can see the comment, right? Mm-hmm. So basically, it's about focus on the pairing in the child generation first.
Yep.
Before proceeding to the two-generation story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a great strategy to be able to do that. Yep.
Okay. And so any other questions from the audience? Comments? Anything? If not, then let's put our hands together and thank Dr. Cheng for a wonderful presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, everyone.